Senator Jean Shaheen told us earlier why she's not seeking re-election next year. Well, Joe Manchin is already on the other side, having retired from the Senate after about 14 years. He long walked down the center of the aisle, so to speak, as a Democrat from the red state of West Virginia, even becoming an independent at the tail end of his Senate career. Now he's flirting with a White House run. His new book is called Dead Center, and he joins Walter Isaacson to talk about polarization and the government shutdown.
Thank you, Chris John and Joe Manchin. Welcome to the show.
Oh, Walter, thanks for having me. I appreciate being with you.
We're in the midst of yet again another big government shutdown struggle going on over the past few days. Tell me, what would you do if you were still in the Senate right now?
You know, it's funny. I've been thinking about that. Just today, I was thinking about what could have been done. I can tell you this. I would have been gathering up whatever Republicans I could and whatever Democrats I could and started meeting like we always did when we knew the leadership got to an impasse. When we knew that they were playing politics or they were being pressured from the White House or from their base, we got together. We could always get about 8 of us, 4 Ds and 4 Rs. I don't know if they're still there. I would like to think there's a mindset still there. But get together and then come up with what we thought was reasonable that we could agree on and we could sell it to our bases, or basically our caucuses, and then go into the leadership with both John Thune, who's a good person, a good friend of mine, and Chuck Schumer, who I can talk to and always have and been a friend. So we have our differences, we all do, but this is not a time to shut government down. There's never a time to admit you couldn't do your job. And that's what you're doing when you shut down, Walter.
Yeah, you talk about these gangs of 8 or gangs of 10 or so, where you have 4 or 5 from each side and do it in the middle. Used to do that a whole lot. How come that's not possible now? Why is it that the Senate, which is supposed to do such things, you can't even find 10, 12 people to say, we will be the center and we will hold it together?
I like to think they're still there. They're still my friends, and I know them very well, and I talk to as many as I can. But the push from the White House and the dominance that Donald Trump has over the party and over the caucus is nothing like that's ever been known or seen before. He doesn't camouflage anything. That when he's upset, when he's against you, he wants you out. He'll be fighting against you, this and that. And I've just said, whoever the president, I'll never forget Robert C. Byrd, the former senator from West Virginia, who passed away and I replaced. He always told me, Joe, he says, make it very clear to you, I have never worked for a president, nor will I ever work for a president. I work to uphold my oath to the Constitution and to the people from our great state of West Virginia, and that's it. But do it with a tear in your eye and do it respectfully. And I always adhere to that. So I'm saying that our Republican friends and leadership have to say, Mr. President, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. Do you remember when he and Mr. McConnell fell out pretty bad in his first term? It was over trying to, hey, I got 50, you got 54 Republicans, give me what I need. And they said, Mr. President, it doesn't work that way. Tried to explain it. He got very upset about that. But I think hopefully he understands now the filibuster protects both sides when they're in the minority. And what goes around comes around, Walter. This will happen again. It'll change.
Explain to me then why the Republicans, all your colleagues and friends from back in the days when you're in the Senate, you know them all. What is Trump doing to them? I mean, why has Trump turned it into a pure authority of the president? And these people, you can't even find 5 or 6 of them to stand up.
Well, you remember how we should say it's guilt by association. They'd see you talking to someone and say, oh, you're colluding with Walter now. You must be on Walter's side. Okay. And I said, now it's guilt by conversation. We can't even have a conversation, let alone get together and have a meal or talk over.
Wait, is that because of Trump?
I think that it's put it much more on the front burner because he makes no bones. He's going after retribution to anybody who's opposed him in the past. He's using the judicial system, which I would say, Mr. President, trust me, this will bite you. Whatever you think you're doing today to satisfy your own desires, it'll come back and bite you worse than what you ever can anticipate. Please don't do it. And I'm asking my Republican friends, you have a constitutional right. Do not abdicate your responsibilities as you take the separation of the 3 equal powers, executive, legislative, and judicial. Work autonomously, but work under the respect saying, Donald Trump is our president. He's my president. He's your president. We want him to succeed. To succeed, you have to be able to speak truth to power respectfully. If you can't do that, then you're not helping your president.
You just used the word retribution, which really does seem to sum up what's happening now with Donald Trump using the judiciary, as you said, Congress and everything, to have retribution against anybody who opposes him. Why is that? I mean, how is that being allowed to happen? And what could that do to our system if it becomes a system of retribution?
Well, again, my friends in the Republican majority in the Senate right now and also in the House, silence is deafening. Silence is truly deafening, Walter, and they're not saying a word and speaking up. Let me give you a little bit what goes around comes around. 2013, Harry Reid was being pressured by the Obama administration. We've got to get our people confirmed. So you're going to have to do the nuclear option. That means bypass the filibuster. They should have been able to sit down and work through the differences this way. Will and pleasure, when a president is elected, that president ought to have the ability to put his staff together as quickly as possible that he can do the job that people elected him to do. Now, with that being said, that should only be a 51 vote threshold. No cloture vote, no 60 vote threshold, just 51. And say, listen, that's because their will and pleasure. The president wants them in his administration, and when he leaves, they leave. They're not held over for some other administration that might have a complete different philosophy or ideology. That's what they should have worked out, but they didn't. So Harry pulls the trigger on the nuclear option, and then also on the circuit and district judges. Guess what happened? Within a couple of years, Mitch McConnell, Republicans are in the majority. They pull the plug, nuclear option on Supreme Court justices.
And you're talking about getting rid of the filibuster.
Getting rid of the filibuster. So what goes around comes around. If the president thinks retribution is a way you can basically hold your staff and show how tough you are and go after the people that you think went after you unfairly without setting an example of justice and the rule of law, that goes around, it's going to come around. And I'll guarantee you, the Democrats will be justified in using it. This is what's wrong. There's not enough character there to stand up and say, just because you did it to me, I'm not doing it to you. I'm going to show you how we lead. I'm going to show you how you have empathy and sympathy. But those people will pay the price in the public polling.
You've mentioned twice in this conversation, you mentioned it right a whole lot in your book, Dead Center, a very strong narrative book about the filibuster and why it must be protected, something many of your Democratic colleagues don't believe in as well. Explain why you would protect the filibuster, and you did so during the Biden years.
The filibuster is the only tool in politics, not just in America, but any place in the world that I've ever known. The filibuster is the only thing that gives input to the minority. Most governments, most legislators, whoever's in the majority has total absolute power. That's the way it works in Congress. You get 218, you don't have to even consider the minority side. But in the Senate, you always have to consider the minority to have input. That's why we've had the stability that we've had in our laws, in our financial system, everything that we put in. It's hard. When they call it the most deliberate body in the world, Walter, you know better than anybody. It is hard to pass legislation. It's even harder to repeal it or get rid of it.
Well, okay, wait. Hard to pass legislation. Let me take an example from your career, which is after Sandy Hook. You called it one of the darkest days in American history. And you and a Republican Senator, Pat Toomey, had a bill that would have addressed gun violence in sort of a balanced way. And yet, because of the filibuster, even it couldn't get through. Isn't that a problem? I mean, aren't we having more dark days because of the filibuster?
Here's what we should have done. We should have brought that bill up 2 or 3 times, working and let the public do its work. It was simply a registration, basically. You had to have a background check in order to get a gun. Anybody that grew up in a gun culture like me and you and everyone else that had people had guns around us, you learn you know how to carry a gun, when to have it loaded. You never loan a gun to an irresponsible member of your family, and you never sell a gun to someone you don't know. That's just the gun etiquette that we talk. We call it gun sense. And that's all we try to do. I didn't know anybody didn't have a background check when they bought a gun, or if their dad bought a gun for them. That's just the way it was done. That's all we asked for. Let's at least know that what people that are going to gun shows and buying 2 sacks of guns, what's the purpose? And did we do a background check to see if this was a credible person or a responsible person? None of that. That's all we asked. and couldn't even get that done because of the toxic political atmosphere.
But also because of the filibuster.
80% of the people believed it. And here's the thing. That's why it's deliberate. We could have run it the first time and gone back and said, listen, please contact those. We lost 3 or 4 Democrats that didn't vote for it because they thought it would hurt them in their reelection. They lost anyway. These were dear friends of mine. And I told them it's not going to make a difference. The problem is, Walter, when I did what I did with the Manchin Toomey bill, with the background check, my entire state thought, oh, Joe turned against us. He don't want us to have our Second Amendment rights. I took time to go back home and go to every gun store in West Virginia and explain, this is a fairness. This is what we learned when we were young. This is what you all teach. All we're asking for is that when you go to a gun show, there shouldn't be someone that has a table next to you that paid $250 to sell whatever they want to and not required a background check. But you as a licensed dealer had to have it if you're at that gun show. That's unfair competition. But you have to go out and explain what you've done. Nobody, I guess, didn't want to work that hard, but it didn't tank me. I was able to get reelected in 2018 after doing it. And you just got to work. Can't give up.
You became an independent in 2024, having been a Democratic governor, Democratic senator from your state. And you became an independent. You explain it in the book Dead Center because you felt that neither party represented the common sense center. I'm going to read you a quote from that book, which is, I am thoroughly convinced that the majority of people in our country share my common sense politics, which is not the least bit hard to sum up. Put people first, country before party, be fiscally responsible, and socially compassionate. That's it. Why have there not been more people in public office, citizens who say, okay, I'm going to go this independent route? Why have we become more polarized instead of more independent?
Walter, the majority of people participating in the political process today are registered no party affiliation like me, independent.
Well, then why are all the government officials, congressmen, senators, polarizing rather than playing to that large group of Americans who are independent?
Because the duopoly of the business acumen of the Democrat and Republican corporations have shut this thing down to where no one else can participate. They make it almost impossible to get through a primary. They can target primaries. They're not opening up primaries. They're not embracing ranked choice voting or an open primary or a 51% majority before you can take office. There's very few states, only 2 that I know of, that do all of that. They don't want that to happen because they can control the flow. If you can control, and I'll use a perfect example, the 2024 election. Think about that, Walter. Just not that long ago, 2024 election, there was about $11 billion spent. But with that being said, only thing we heard about was 7 battleground states. 43 states were predetermined. Only 7. That's where the middle. They were looking for that middle. But you know what? You elect someone from the middle, they go to Washington, pick a side, left or right. There's no center, maybe center left, center right. There's no moderate middle. There's no structure for that because the system doesn't allow. That's what has to be broken down.
You've said the reason that we can't come together in the center is money in politics and social media. What else do you think is dividing?
Walter, I can tell you this. If I could have put a team together and worked in this 2024 election and got on 50 ballots, we could have contended. We could have basically made a position where the middle and the people could have voted for the middle. And not.
When you thought about that, why did you do it?
They couldn't get on 50 ballots. The way that it's almost impossible. They had to, I think, no labels, friends of ours, and tried everything humanly possible. Got on 16 ballots, and that took them over a year, and I think $30 or $40 million. It's almost impossible to do, but it can be done and should be done.
If you had run in 2024, because I know you thought about it, you had a lot of lunches and dinners about it, would you have run with a Republican running mate?
Absolutely. Someone who's a former Republican that has that same philosophy that I had. I'd have ran as their vice president, didn't make any difference. I wasn't there. I said, listen, let's go in there and heal this country. Let's start make sure that they know we're the United States. And you can only do that by uniting the 2 former parties that have gone completely to their extremes. And that's not who we are. And there's a lot of Republicans, good Republicans, and former good Democrats. I couldn't remain a Democrat any longer, and I couldn't join the Republican Party. And I told people, they said, "Why don't you just be a Republican?" I said, "They won't like me any more than Democrats." I said, "Walter, I've never met a Republican that was always wrong, and I never met a Democrat that's always right. They're both my friends. And I never campaigned against the Republicans running for reelection. That's why I did so much in the middle. That's why dead center, just having some basic decency about you, that I'm not going to come out and campaign against you on the weekend, then come back Monday when we're in the Senate together, you be a D and I be an R, or vice versa." And I said, "Walter, will you work with me on this?" He says, "Hell no, Joe, you just went out and tried to defeat me. You've given $10,000 to my opponent out of your PAC trying to defeat me. Why do you think I want to work with you?" That's the atmosphere we have in Washington that has to stop.
Well, if you want to stop it, because in Washington you have that atmosphere, why isn't Americans Together, which you're helping to push, why doesn't it run for state legislatures and other places? Get this from the ground up.
Well, we're trying to do that. We're trying to accumulate the resources that we can protect people that truly put their country or their state or the office before themselves, commit themselves to basically, I think of saying term limits. I believe that if you put term limits on a national ballot, it passed by 80%. No senator should be there longer than 12 years, 2 terms. House being 6 2-year terms, 12 years. President should be 1 6-year term. The president, the commander in chief, should not spend one day thinking about a reelection. Do your job every day. And the Supreme Court, 18 years. I think that would pass.
With all these things, constitutional amendments, how are we going to fix it now as we go into our 250th birthday and become more polarized? How could you possibly start a centrist movement that's going to work?
Well, let's see what type of centrists are running on whatever ticket they're running on. Let's say on a Democrat ticket. Let's say in the 2026 midterms, the people say enough's enough. We're just going to flip it. We're not crazy about where the Democrats have gone. And we're upset that the Republicans have so much power. We're going to try to neutralize that a little bit. That's going to give you a telltale sign. That's why they're so concerned about redistricting right now and going back and playing games with that. I hope California doesn't join in to Texas and some of the other ones are doing. And I would like to see it backfire when you think you can stack the deck and get what you want. You'll get caught and it'll come back and backfire on you. So that's yet to be seen.
Are you going to run for president in 2028 with a Republican ticket?
Walter, I'm going to do whatever I can to help my country. I truly am. And there's a lot of good people I am trying to recruit. I'm having a harder time recruiting people to just participate than ever before. Now, with all this violence, people are more scared of that as they are basically saying nasty things about them and putting things about your past and your family and on and on. I can live with all that, but people now are truly concerned about their life. And that's wrong. We should not accept violence anyway, and it has to be put out. It has to stop.
Joe Manchin, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Walter, it's always great being with you. Thank you.
Now, from a tariff war, as we discussed earlier in the program, to tax cuts for the rich, is there method in Trump's MAGA-nomics? Our next guest thinks so, and he's calling it his, quote, weapon of mass distraction. NYU professor, entrepreneur, and podcast host Scott Galloway joins Hari Srinivasan to break down what Trump's head-spinning, constantly shifting economic policies mean for the state of American finances.
Christian, thanks. Scott Galloway, thanks for being back with us. Last time you and I spoke, we were talking about your book, Adrift. And at that time, you said, America as a country isn't lost, but rather adrift and unmoored. And I wonder, since that time, has your assessment changed?
Well, you could argue that it's found direction. Unfortunately, I think the direction is more a direction around change towards a quarter of each party. Democrats are just as guilty of this as Republicans, are in favor of an autocrat as long as that autocrat shares their views. And I think that's sort of come to fruition here. I think the superseding of our checks and balances of different branches of government, such that one political party that is in control can sort of bypass the traditional constitutional measures or safeguards, reflects that America has become, if you will, more open or accepting to the notion of an autocracy. I think we are pretty much in a full kind of, call it maybe most generously, autocracy light. And much of America voted for this.
Do you think that, say, for example, what's happening in the stock market is a reflection of people's dissatisfaction with this direction that you're talking about? I mean, I think the S&P's had one of its worst weeks ever. All the gains that we had since the election have practically been wiped out.
I wouldn't say it's dissatisfaction because that implies that they're upset about it. The market is pretty unemotional and is focused on increasing earnings, and people will buy stocks regardless. Sentiment sort of takes a backseat to financial considerations. I think what's happening in the market is, first off, you have to acknowledge that even with these drawdowns, the market is still substantially up from where it was just 6 months ago. It has come back from pre-election. The Trump bump has been wiped out. I think what you're seeing, quite frankly, is a couple of things. The market just may have gotten, quite frankly, overvalued. But I think the thing that kind of triggered the sell-off, if you will, is what appears to be irrational, non-economic decisions around tariffs, where we're basically ripping up these 80-year-long alliances with trusted economic partners that engage in mutually beneficial trade, and that these are not only a bad idea in the specific agreements we're ripping up, but America is losing a very important brand association for economic relationships or geopolitical negotiations, and that is one of consistency.
You know, there was an estimate by the Yale Budget Lab that these tariffs are going to cost the average household somewhere between $1,600 and $2,000 every year. It's also estimated to reduce our GDP as much as $110 billion a year. You know, and one of the lines of thinking that I hear from members of the administration is, look, if these short-term hits can get us better leverage to try to negotiate longer-term prosperity for America, this will have been worth it. Does that make sense?
Well, to be fair, tariffs aren't all bad. Sometimes you need tariffs as a hammer to restore symmetry to an asymmetric trade relationship. Biden maintained the initial Trump tariffs. I think some of Trump's initial instincts around the asymmetry of the trading relationship between China and the U.S. were accurate. What this is, though, is just plain non-economic. I was a graduate student instructor in microeconomics in graduate school. We used to talk about tariffs, I imagine, the same way that professors in medical school talk about leeches. Like, can you believe they were stupid enough to actually think this would work? And the notion that we're putting ourselves in a position to negotiate some big, beautiful deal, I don't think it's going to work because Trump tore up the Iran deal and now appears to want it again. The tariffs are off and on. I just don't think we're seen now as a reliable partner that can be counted on with the economic livelihood of your country. Think about Canada. We're not even able to give Canada a good reason for why he's doing this. The kind of the stated reason from the administration for what is tariffs that will hurt our economy and dramatically hurt the Canadian economy is that the unchecked transfer of fentanyl across the Canadian border. You could take the amount of fentanyl that's come across the U.S.-Canadian border and put it in a backpack. Estimates are that it's less than 1%. And to alienate your closest allies, think about Canada, Ari. It's the largest undefended border in the world. What does that tell you about our relationship to this point with Canada? They joined us in World War I. They were in World War II before us, training Allied pilots. They were side by side with us in Kosovo in our fights against the Taliban. Amazing economic prosperity. We have NBA and NHL teams in America and in Canada, respectively. And I love that question, Hari, that was presented by a Holocaust survivor around evaluating who are your real friends. And that is, it comes down to one question for her. Would they hide me? And that's a really puncturing, kind of rattling question to evaluate your friends by. But by that standard, Canada is one of our best friends. In the Iran hostage crisis, they hid American diplomats and under great personal risk ensured their safe escape from Iran. And they stayed behind. And had they been caught, there was a good chance they would have been hanged from cranes. So Canada has hid us. They are real friends. And for us to recklessly, irrationally, and inexplicably try to hurt them in exchange for what might be some big, beautiful deal, the damage here to unwind and repair will take the better part of the 80 years it took to make these amazing, prosperous relationships that, quite frankly, the administration, in my view, is irrationally taken for granted.
So, how does the world deal with this kind of uncertainty?
So the VIX, which measures volatility as evidenced by trading and options, has spiked. And the Atlanta Fed has a metric for trying to project what GDP growth might look like in the coming year. In the last 45 days, it's gone from a projected growth of GDP of 4%, which is really robust growth, to negative 2.8. The economy is contracting faster than it has since the COVID lockdowns. Obviously, the markets are chilled. I think the silver lining here, I always like to ask myself, what could go right? Because over the medium and the long term, the majority of the metrics in the world do get better. And it's easy for someone like me to try and sound smarter than they are by always being negative. So I think it's an important question to say, what could go right? And I think the silver lining here is that Europe is in fact becoming a union because they realize they can no longer count on the military economic umbrella or the geopolitical consistency of America. America spends about $800 billion. NATO and all EU nations spend about $430 on the military. And quite frankly, they have gotten, I would call, lazy and expectant around the military umbrella being provided by the U.S. They now are convinced they can no longer count on the U.S. to be pro-democracy and make what are rational decisions and honor this kind of post-World War II order. They realize they can no longer count on or expect the military umbrella of the U.S. They will dramatically increase their spending on military, which I think will have stimulative and spillover effects. I think the silver lining here is that Europe is going to begin to command the space it occupies. Keep in mind the total GDP of European nations is 19 trillion. The GDP of Russia is 2 trillion. So there's no reason why Europe, if it gets its act together, shouldn't be able to push back and be a credible opposing threat to an economy that is, again, smaller than the size of Canada, Russia.
You've been pointedly critical of Elon Musk in the past several months and really even a couple of years. But in light of the Department of Government Efficiency, I think there is a consensus that people on both sides of the aisle are interested in making government function better, making it more responsive and efficient. But what have you seen over the past couple of months that give you pause on whether this is going to have longer term effects and perhaps unintended consequences?
Well, every administration from Clinton Gore has had some sort of task force to try and root out inefficiency, fraud, and waste. So far, if DOGE is an audit of the U.S. government, then the U.S. government has been issued a clean bill of health because this wall of receipts is surprisingly scant. The first one said claimed they were saving $8 billion. It ended up to be $8 million of spending that had already been spent. And then numbers 2, 3, and 4 on the list of DOGE receipts that have since been taken down were just blatantly false. The Wall Street Journal reports that so far DOGE has found $2.6 billion in cost savings. You could 6x the savings from DOGE to date by cutting off all subsidies to Tesla, which has cost taxpayers $15 billion. But I think it's more mendacious than that, Ari. I mean, yeah, we all like the idea of cutting waste, but I believe it's a misdirect. And that is, while we're all kind of have our hair on fire and looking over here at Doja, $2.6 billion, the indignance, the emotional upset of firing good people doing good work, or just the general incompetence of laying off air traffic controllers or firing people overseeing our nuclear stockpile and then trying to hire them back. I believe for the most part, it's a strategic weapon of mass distraction to get you to look over here as the Trump administration is planning to increase our deficit by $800 billion a year with tax cuts to the wealthy. All of this is a misdirect. It's sad. It's unfortunate. It's incompetent. These savings are illusory, right? But at the end of the day, I think it's a purposeful distraction from the tax cuts they are trying to put forward at the expense of future generations.
Do you think that Elon is getting a net positive benefit from this? Because on the one hand, he has gained incredible proximity to power and, in fact, power for his $250 million contribution to the campaign. On the other hand, the value from Tesla shares have been evaporating because he seems to have alienated a huge chunk of the people that used to buy his cars.
I think the political calculus here was miscalculated on his part. We were talking about Nike off mic. When Nike embraced Colin Kaepernick, which was a political position, they had done the math, and that is 2/3 of their revenue comes from people outside of the US or people under the age of 30, none of whom thought the US had it right on race relations. So they purposely tickled the censors or cemented their kind of progressive ideology among a customer base that they knew would appreciate that. Musk has made exactly the wrong calculation, and that is 3/4 of Republicans would never consider buying an EV anyway. His largest market is California, and sales are down 11%. In Europe, sales are off 75% in Germany and between 20 and 30 in other big EU markets. So essentially, Tesla has shed 1/3 of its value in the last month. It's given back all of its gain since the Trump election. What is really going to hurt his pocketbook is that it has now jumped the lab and is now starting to infect SpaceX, specifically Starlink, who is seeing contracts being canceled by people ranging from Canada to Poland, is saying, we can't count on you for something as important as communications and battlefield communications technology. So they're reconsidering their Starlink contract. So I would argue the political calculus here from Mr. Musk was wildly inaccurate, and he is seeing a lot of his wealth evaporate because the negative associations of Musk are starting to infect not only the Tesla brand, but also the SpaceX brand. So I think it was an irrational decision from a purely economic standpoint.
Here we were at the inauguration, and we saw lined up next to the president literally the who's who of technology and billionaires standing next to him. And I wonder, is this just business as usual? Or was it, is this different than what the Carnegies or the Rockefellers might have done 100 years ago? Is it just the optics that are different now? Or is there something more structurally more destructive?
It's a fair question, because I think a lot of people on the right would maybe fairly say, look, we may be more transparent and brazen about it, but it's nothing that lobbyists and lawyers and the media have been doing for the left. They've just done it more quietly and elegantly. When the most powerful or wealthy tech executives in the world are all willing to be intimidated into donating to an inaugural campaign, which they didn't do in 2020, despite publicly stating their politics were more in line with Biden than Trump, when they're willing to be paraded around for the benefit of the Trump administration, you have what I'd call a domino of cowardice. And that is, they text my pivot co-hosts that they hate themselves and that they hate showing up in the inauguration, and then they show up. And then that gives Linda Yaccarino, the CEO of X, the confidence to demand that an ad agency advertise on their platform, or they risk having their merger blocked by her buddy who has proximity to the president. What we don't want to acknowledge in America is that rights and democracy are now a function of how much money you have, full stop. The wealthy technocrats and the 0.1% feel as if, and quite frankly, it may be true, that they are protected by the law, but not bound by it. Whereas the rest of the 99% are bound by the law, but not protected by it.
I wonder, getting back to those CEOs for a second, I wonder if they now or will always have a shield that says, hey, listen, I'm just doing what's right for my shareholders. This is my fiduciary responsibility. So I give $1 million to the campaign or to the inauguration. You know what? It could help our stock down the line. Or if I don't give the $1 million, it could certainly hurt my stock down the line. And that's, as CEO, that's who I'm supposed to, be loyal to.
I think that's a fair argument, Hari. But what I would ask is they don't ever use the term stakeholders again. Remember all this BS over the last 10 years where they start talking about stakeholders? Well, all right, the country, democracy, poor people, people who aren't politically connected, people who don't have stock options in Apple, the 99% that only own 10% of stocks. Are you supposed to also be representing them? Are you supposed to have some fidelity to the values, the rule of law, democracy, checks and balances that help get you so rich in the first place? Because let me list all of the CEOs who have filled this leadership void and have said, I am more concerned about the long-term health of America and what it means for private and public companies. And I'm not going to engage in this sort of this kleptocracy. I'm not going to be an agent. So here are some of the CEOs who have filled this leadership void. Okay, list over. At some point, these people, many of whom talk about running for president, many of whom claim to be great Americans, many of whom constantly voice their gratitude for what is the best experiment and the best platform in the world for establishing economic security and rights. At some point, you'd like to think they're going to show some fidelity to the democracy and principles and rule of law and checks and balances that played a huge role in their wealth. But instead, they default to this, quite frankly, cold comfort of, well, I'm a fiduciary for shareholders. Let's be honest, just kiss his ass, give him $1 million and stay out of the crosshairs. It's probably good in the short term. The question is, at what point does someone stand up and say, okay, I'm representing the bottom 99%, I'm representing democracy, and I'm representing what America is supposed to stand for, and paying it forward based on the incredible rule of law, democracy, fair competition that got me here in the first place. So I think the domino of cowardice here in the private sector is not only shocking, it's just very disappointing.
Author and professor and podcast host of both Prof G and Pivot, Scott Galloway. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Hari. Always good to see you.
Now, in the United States, the government remains shut down for a third consecutive week. Why? Because Republicans and Democrats are still at an impasse over a key funding bill. Today, it failed to advance in the Senate for a 10th time, and the stalemate is already having reverberations on the economy, travel, museums, and the payroll of federal workers. The Trump administration has now been temporarily blocked from laying off thousands of government employees. A judge called it politically motivated. Democratic Senator from Virginia, Mark Warner, joins Michelle Martin now to discuss how mass layoffs are impacting his state and about his fears of a looming healthcare crisis.
Thanks, Christiane. Senator Mark Warner, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, obviously, we called you. One of the reasons that we called you is that we're into, I guess, the third week of the government shutdown by now. The president is threatening to lay off federal workers. It appears that there seems to be some arrangement to pay military personnel, at least. Virginia is disproportionately affected by this. I mean, you have a significant percentage of the workforce, the non-farm workforce, are federal employees, and you have the second largest number of military personnel of any state in the country after California. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what are your constituents telling you about this? What are you hearing from them?
Well, first of all, I'm glad the military is getting paid. But remarkably, at least at this stage of this process, I'm hearing from federal workers pretty consistently that they feel like they have been traumatized by Trump administration. They feel that Russ Vought, the OMB director, who Trump himself has called the Grim Reaper, is really coming after federal workers on an unfair basis. Matter of fact, the president has no greater ability during a shutdown to fire workers than in traditional times. So they feel very much victimized. They want us to push back. We also believe very strongly that, the idea of that healthcare cliff that's not going to come at the end of the year, that literally comes November 1st when people get their increased healthcare costs and will have to buy in the marketplace. We don't have the luxury of waiting till the end of the year. Put on top of the fact that, the president of the United States has only sat down with the Democratic leadership one time on this whole issue. I know the president's been running around the world, and some of these things he's done have been successful. I commend him on that. But the idea that he is not taking this shutdown seriously and sitting down and trying to work this out, I think is a great failure of leadership. And we could actually do both. We could deal with the healthcare crisis, get the workforce back in. And frankly, at the end of the day, the president continuing to ratchet up threats, if anything, I think makes not only the Democrats, but it makes the federal workforce more angry and more frustrated.
Do you think that this it creates a wedge, actually, between civilians and military personnel getting paid and civilians are not?
I hope not. I hope that the president of the United States would recognize that all of these federal workers contribute to the safety of our country, and whether it's in putting their lives on the line, or for that matter, inspecting the milk and the food that we drink or eat, that protects Americans as well. And having those folks not paid isn't fair or right. We have said for some time, this was an imminently preventable crisis We knew the healthcare costs were going up. The administration knew. We've got clinics closing already in my state because of this fear of this healthcare cliff. Let's do these together. And there is a lack of trust because so far we've seen, even when we reach agreement with this administration, we've seen the OMB director arbitrarily come in after the fact and arbitrarily choose which program to fund or not to fund. That's just not the way the law ought to operate.
So let's talk about the substance of this for people, because everybody isn't following this as closely as you are, and certainly as people who are closely connected to the federal workforce are. The immediate issue, the Republicans argue that the Democrats are being recalcitrant and not passing what they call a clean continuing resolution, which keeps funding at the same levels as the previous budget. The Democrats say that the issue here is the expiration of these subsidies for people who buy health care on the Affordable Care Act marketplace. Without these subsidies, the cost to the buyer is going to increase precipitously. And that, as you pointed out, the timeline is coming up for these insurance premiums to be priced out. People are going to have to make decisions for their sort of budget. But in essence, both sides are sort of pointing fingers at each other. So can you just...
One of the things you just said, I got to take issue with.
Go ahead.
The idea that this is a normal CR just isn't the case. Historically, and we've passed a bunch of these, the Democrats and the Republicans sit down together, work out their deal, and then say, we're going to take a time out to finish them. None of that took place. Usually it involves the White House as well. The Republicans felt like we don't need Democrats at all, so we're going to box them out, number one. Number two, we've seen in the past when we've gotten close to these kind of shutdown circumstances, which are always an awful option, the President of the United States engaged. Biden engaged repeatedly. Actually, when McCarthy was the speaker, he used the speakership very much to his advantage in getting Biden to the table. Trump has had one meeting and then kind of blown it off. And the immediacy of the healthcare bite is such that people are already getting these notices. My fear is the Republicans want to not acknowledge the costs going up. They're afraid as Americans see these notices coming out, which will happen more in late October than in early October, Americans are going to across the country revolt. And the issue here again is it's not just the 24 million Americans who buy their health insurance through these marketplaces, but if we drive millions of Americans out of the healthcare system, and our healthcare system isn't perfect to start with, and drive them all back into the emergency room, that is going to collapse the healthcare system. Everybody's healthcare rates are going to go up. We want to avoid that. We can avoid that. But you got to get in the room and talk about these things. I don't think it's an unreasonable ask to say, let's sit down. And frankly, at this stage of the game, the one thing we do know is the Republican leadership has no say in this. End of the day, this is all going to be decided, at least on the Republican side, by Donald Trump. So we need the president's engagement. We need to sit down. Reasonable people can work this out, particularly the president coming off of a very successful effort in the Middle East. Let's see those make a deal skills work back here at home and avoid this healthcare crisis and get our federal workforce back to work and get them paid.
So you've laid out the substance of the argument. You have to assume that the White House and the Republicans believe that the politics are on their side in this, that they are willing to risk people either being unable to afford health insurance, dropping out of the system altogether, et cetera. Why are they wrong?
Well, all of the data I've seen so far indicates that Americans overwhelmingly don't want the healthcare system to explode. Now, again, that's today. Who knows in a few weeks? But I think in a few weeks, the circumstance gets worse for the president because these hypothetical price increases, people are going to get the letters and go, holy crap. My rates went from $800 a month to $2,100 a month, which a couple in Roanoke in my state would receive if they make, roughly $80,000 a year. That is a dramatic increase. And I don't know how that improves for the president and his party, other than the fact that it's going to make more people say, hey, we cannot afford this dramatic increase.
The argument that the Republicans are making is that voting for the CR, the continuing resolution, is a way to buy time to have those kinds of conversations. Why are they wrong?
They're wrong because we've gone through CRs already. We knew this cliff was coming, and there was no engagement. We're operating right now under a CR. Well, actually, it expired at the end of the fiscal year, but we passed a CR back in March. There was plenty of time to negotiate this. I feel like there is this sense that the president feels so emboldened that he basically can blow off Congress. And one of the things that I've been surprised that my Republican colleagues haven't risen up and said, hey, we actually got to have a say on this as well. But frankly, there's not much of a Republican Party. There's a Trump party. And if there was real interest in negotiating on this, why didn't it happen before September 30th? And so taking a promise from somebody who hasn't kept their word so far, even when there was the CR in place and they've arbitrarily picked which programs to fund, how you go into that circumstance where people, fool me once, it's my fault, fool me twice, I'm a fool. And we've seen that kind of activity from this OMB and from this president in terms of cutting back on programs that were actually agreed on. There's not a lot of trust, as we know. Let's get the president in the room. Let's make this deal. I think you get a handshake in a single day. The details on how you extend the ACA subsidies will take some time. But I think you could get to a deal and get this government reopened right away. But it's not going to be based on some future promise to negotiate when we've seen a lack of trust, a lack of follow through from the president on so many items.
The irony being that, according to an analysis by the KFF Health News, the majority of buyers of these policies under the Affordable Care Act are actually in Republican states.
Absolutely. They're all from states that didn't expand Medicaid. And again, this is just on the Affordable Care Act. We've already seen the $1 trillion hit that has been taken to Medicaid, which again, curiously enough, our Republican friends didn't have kick in until after next year's midterm elections, where again, about 11 million additional Americans will lose their health care coverage.
You all have private conversations. I understand that publicly there are no sort of discussions going on, but I assume you have side conversations. You have people you've known for years. You've served, this is like your third term. You've served with people for years. Private conversations? Any private conversations going on? When you point this out, what do they say?
I've been part of every bipartisan group in the Senate in the last decade. I have great Republican friends who I know, want to get this resolved. But in today's Washington, no Republican senator or congressman, with the exception of one or two, will go against the president. They are not going to move in any serious way unless the president says so. So the idea that we could, in the classic way, the Senate would work its will with Republicans and Democrats coming to a conclusion and then go to the president, that's just not the reality of the world we live in today. Donald Trump controls every action of the Republican Senate. There is no independent actors. There are no independent actors. So no matter what good faith conversations are taking place, without the president's involvement, I don't know how we get this resolved.
But I guess I'm curious. Here's where I'm asking you to speculate. President Trump is very attentive to people in his constituencies that he perceives as being part of his constituencies, his base, as it were. So I guess the question becomes, why would he be willing to allow people to go without health insurance or see these premiums rise, at least the cost to the buyer rise as precipitously as it is projected they will? Do you have a theory about that?
I only know what was reported from the one meeting where the Democrats met with President Trump. And it seemed, at least at that point, the president was not aware of how dramatic this cliff would be at the end of October. I think he's probably got to be more informed now, but he's obviously been focused on the circumstances in the Middle East and Gaza. He's had been focused on other items. I hope and pray he comes back focused on this crisis at hand here at home. We're not going to make America great if we destroy an already challenged healthcare system. But so far, that hasn't come to pass. I mean, if the president sat down and had 2 or 3 sessions and didn't get to a deal, I think his position would be strengthened. Not urging him to come in and be adamant about not opening negotiation, but the ask that's being made is, let's sit down in a room and try to work this out. Isn't that a reasonable approach? Aren't you, Mr. Trump, supposedly the world's best deal maker? And his refusal to do so, I agree with you. I don't get it.
The Republicans, up to and including the vice president, have been arguing that what Democrats are really after is to subsidize health care for illegal immigrants.
That is
What if-
factually wrong.
What are the facts of that?
Let me just finish. Let me finish. That is factually wrong. I would hope the vice president would know the law. I know he didn't spend much time in the Senate, but the law prohibits any federal dollars going in Medicaid, in the Affordable Care Act, in any other program to undocumented people in this country. He should know it. To state otherwise is a lie. And it is, I think, frankly, disrespectful to the 24 million Americans who are about to lose their health care coverage.
And the basis of that is what? As I understand it, the basis of that is that emergency rooms, as you just pointed out, have to treat all comers. Is that the basis of the logic of that?
Right. That is a law called Intella that says if you show up at the emergency room, even if you don't have coverage, even if we don't know who you are, we're not going to let you bleed out on the floor in the emergency room. I think that is the law of most civilized nations. And the irony here is if you are going to take these 24 million Americans and drive them out of the system because they can't afford it and have them show up at the emergency room, all you're really doing is putting additional burden on the emergency room. That's going to also drive up healthcare costs for the other Americans who've got traditional private health insurance, because that, for the most part, comes in as what's called uncompensated care. The hospital has to eat it. That means it's going to drive up rates for everybody else. Some of this is just plain math 101. And the fact that the vice president is making this baseless, false argument, they have assumed for a while that there's huge amounts of the presumption is all of these programs must be riddled with graft, even in states that are controlled by Republicans, if somehow non-Americans are getting this assistance. I don't believe that is the case. And it would be obviously a great black eye for those Republican-controlled states where the disproportionate number of people are who are buying through the marketplaces. But the law is 100% explicitly clear. And again, I am disappointed the vice president doesn't know the law of the country.
Do you see any way forward here? I understand that you specifically on just getting to an agreement, your argument is, as your other colleagues are on the Democratic side, that the president has to get involved, get in the room and sort of and work it out.
Well, I also say, let me just quickly add, I don't think there's any Republican senator I've talked to who hasn't privately said to me, Mark, we got to get Trump in this. We're not going to do anything without Trump's approval.
But substantively, do you see a way forward that you could support? Because, there are Republicans who have been consistent. They just say, you know what, the subsidies are too expensive. Like I've had conversations with Republican senators, and some of them are consistent. It's just too expensive. We can't afford it.
Yes. I see path forward substantively that avoid the cliff. And if there are reforms that need to be put in place, put us on a path to get those reforms, avoid the immediate cliff of November, put reforms in place. And frankly, one of the things that I've offered to some of my Republican friends, why don't we put into the debate as well? Because of President Trump's tariffs, many of our farming community, particularly in the Midwest, some of those same Republican states are getting creamed because China's no longer buying soybeans. We're going to need a 10, 15, 20, $25 billion assistance package for the agriculture community across the country. Why that isn't introduced into this conversation, I'm not sure why either, because, we're going to get this done, and I believe it will get done, and then the president will come back and say, oh, I forgot we need another bucket of money. Why we wouldn't go ahead and put that into the conversation right now and get it all resolved and actually show the American people, and for that matter, the rest of the world, we can still function with appropriate checks and balances. That would be a win for everyone, I think, including the president.
Senator Mark Warner, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you so much.
Now to Texas, where a new redistricting plan backed by Republicans is causing a political standoff. Critics accuse them of a partisan power grab as they look to gerrymander more safe seats ahead of the next congressional election. So say the Democrats, many of whom left the state in an attempt to stall this proposal. State Representative James Tallarico joins Michelle Martin to explain why.
Thanks, Christian. Representative Tallarico, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you've got the Texas flag behind you, but you're not actually in Texas. Do you mind telling us where you are?
We're in the state of Illinois. We're trying to be careful because of security concerns. As I'm sure you've reported, President Trump has threatened to send the FBI to come find us. Governor Abbott has threatened to remove us from our duly elected positions in the legislature. And then Ken Paxton, our Attorney General in Texas, sent out a tweet to his thousands of followers asking them to, quote, hunt us down. And so because of all that, we've received a lot of threats, including multiple bomb threats.
Yeah, I heard that there were bomb threats at the place where you were staying. But so when did the idea of breaking quorum, of leaving the state in order to deny the Republicans a quorum, first emerge? How did that happen?
Well, it was when we first started seeing reporting that the president was going to ask Texas Republicans to redraw our political maps in the middle of the decade. Typically, this is done at the beginning of a decade after a new census. That's exactly what happened in Texas in 2021. And once we heard that they may try to rig these maps in the middle of the game so that the president doesn't have to face accountability in the midterms, we knew we may have to take some dramatic actions to protect the democratic process, not just in Texas, but across the country. And so this is, we're not fighting for just Democrats. We're fighting for independents and Republicans, too. This is about whether or not the people, all of us, can change our government from the bottom up, whether we can hold powerful people, including the most powerful man in the country, accountable.
This isn't exactly easy. You got to leave whatever job you have that, the Texas legislature is not, full time. So you have other things to do. You have family members. It's not easy on people's lives. So I just was curious about what were some of the conversations that you had in the caucus about, whether this was the right thing to do or not?
Yeah, it was certainly not a decision we made lightly. As you mentioned, many of my colleagues are leaving behind young children. Some of them are leaving behind aging parents. We're all leaving behind our day jobs, which is how we make ends meet and pay our bills. But we know that this is a lot bigger than us. It's a lot bigger than any one politician or any one political party. This is about whether or not people can elect the representatives of their choice, which is the most fundamental part of this representative democracy. And so we felt like we had to take a stand. And thankfully, we, over the past week, I think have really focused the country's attention on this power grab in Texas. I know that the Google searches for gerrymandering and redistricting are through the roof, which, as a former teacher, that makes my heart happy that people are using this opportunity to learn about our broken political system. And hopefully it sparks a conversation about how to fix this democracy going forward so that it works for everybody.
The Republicans control the governor's office. They control all the top state offices, both United States senators, the attorney general, the governor, et cetera, and both houses of the legislature. OK, but in 2021, Democrats did the same thing to deny Republicans a quorum. That was not perceived as a success. Do you disagree with that assessment? I mean, the bill that you were trying to stop passed anyway. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I would disagree with that assessment, that analysis. When we broke quorum in 2021, it was over a voter suppression bill. And I should say this quorum break and that quorum break, those are the only two quorum breaks in 20 years in Texas. So this is not a common occurrence because of the tremendous cost, financial, personal, political, legal. It's not something that should be undergone without a lot of thought and without a lot of justification. It's an extreme tool that the minority has in our toolbox, and it's protected by the Texas state constitution. And so we're not breaking any laws. We're not doing anything that's not in the House rules. And it's why it's so strange that people are threatening us with arrest and with vacating our seats, because there's a long tradition in Texas and in America. We're here in the land of Lincoln. Abe Lincoln broke quorum as a state senator back in 1840 by jumping out of a window at the Illinois state capitol. So this is a time-honored tradition, and it's not something that we undergo lightly. And so to answer your question, that last quorum break in 2021 over the voter suppression bill, while it didn't kill the bill, it did put a national spotlight on the issue, which pressured our Republican colleagues to take the worst parts out of that bill. A ban on souls to the polls, which is Sunday morning voting, when a lot of African-American churches take their members to have their voices heard in the democratic process. That was taken out of the bill. a provision that would have allowed Republicans in our state to overturn election results that they didn't like. That was taken out of the bill, all because of our quorum break and the attention that it galvanized across the nation.
But, the governor is threatening to try to find a way to vacate your seats so that he can then appoint people to replace you, calling on the FBI, which, of course, Republicans do control now, to go and bring you in, as it were. They're talking about deputizing, the Texas Rangers to somehow cross state lines, which they do not have the authority to do at present. And then they're also talking about, I don't know how this would work, but charging you with bribery if you use any campaign funds to subsidize the costs of this, sort of experience. Do any of those, in your estimation, have any legal force at all?
No. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm a former public school teacher, but I've got a lot of colleagues who are very talented lawyers. And we've brought on a team of lawyers to help us given these threats. All of them agree that the legal theories underpinning these threats are laughable. That doesn't mean they won't succeed. I mean, our courts are highly politicized, especially in Texas. And so we'll see if it works. But if we're just going by rule of law, I think these should be laughed out of court. And I think it's equally laughable that Ken Paxton, the most corrupt politician in Texas, perhaps the most corrupt politician in the country, is accusing us of bribery when he was literally impeached on a bipartisan basis in the Texas House of Representatives for his corruption and for enriching himself and his donors. So this is hypocrisy at the highest level. And I think it's important to realize that this redistricting attempt, this power grab, is corrupt too. We oftentimes think of corruption as just involving money. That is certainly one kind of corruption, but corruption is the abuse of power. It's the betrayal of the public trust. And this is corruption at the highest level.
So talk about the maps then. It's not exactly a secret what their objective is. I mean, their objective is, at the request of the president, he was very clear about this too, to redraw the lines to give Republicans the advantage, or so they believe, in 5 additional seats. And that would mean consolidating seats that are currently held by Democrats, or just basically redrawing the lines. And even the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't redistrict along racial lines. Their argument is that this isn't racial at all. This is partisan, and that that's perfectly allowed. What do you say about that?
Well, one, I would disagree that this is not racial gerrymandering. You take a look at these maps and the communities they divide, the voices they dilute. It is primarily Black and brown. It is African-American communities and it's Latino communities across the state of Texas, 2 growing populations in our state that they are disenfranchising with this racist and discriminatory gerrymandering. But I also want to point out how crazy it is that they seem to be very okay admitting publicly that this is a naked political power grab. That may be legal, but it is certainly not moral. It is certainly not supported by the vast majority of Americans. There was polling data released earlier this week showing that this power grab in Texas is wildly unpopular across the state of Texas, including among Trump supporters, because no one likes cheating. And no one likes rigging an upcoming election. People should be evaluated on their policies and their record. And if those policies are unpopular, then you should face consequences as an elected official, regardless of your political party. And unfortunately, the president has been embroiled in corruption, receiving planes from a foreign government. He's kicking millions of people off their health care to fund tax breaks for billionaires. And those policies and those actions are unpopular. And as the most powerful man in the country, he needs accountability. He needs to face consequences at the ballot box, not just for all of us, but for him. That will make him a better president. So even if you're a Trump supporter, him facing accountability in the next election will make him a better leader for all of us. And I hope we all want that, regardless of how we feel about the president.
It's interesting that your Governor Abbott, Greg Abbott, in a number of his interviews particularly with the conservative media, it has to be said, his argument is that the Democrats who are cheating by leaving the state. He says that Texans stay and fight. And that you're you're abdicating your responsibility, but it's also that you're the ones who are not willing to stay and fight and argue it out. What would you say to that?
Well, we're not running away from a fight. We're running into the fight. We're running to the front lines of this fight. and taking on a lot of risk to do it. We're the ones facing threats, including threats of violence. And Greg Abbott's in his fancy mansion surrounded by security detail. So you tell me who's more courageous in this fight. And I'll just say again that we are taking on all this risk so that we can fight for the people. I think there's a stark moral difference here. Greg Abbott and Texas Republican politicians are willing to disempower the people of Texas to protect their positions. Texas Democrats are willing to give up our positions to empower the people of Texas. That is the starkest contrast that you can draw. And I'm happy to have the people of our state judge us on those merits.
The other argument that people are making, and I've heard this again in the conservative media, is that the Democrats have left for states that are themselves heavily gerrymandered, that have an historic, there's an historic precedent in many of these states for substantially gerrymandered districts, which happen to favor Democrats. So what would you say to that?
I've condemned those maps, including the one here in Illinois. Gerrymandering is wrong, whichever party does it, in whatever part of the country it's done. We have to get gerrymandering out of our politics. And, Democrats in Congress, when they had the majority, they tried to pass a ban on partisan gerrymandering for the whole country, in red states and blue states. And every single Republican in Congress voted against that ban. But gerrymandering is a bipartisan problem and it has to end. All I want to say is that what's happening here in Texas is a whole nother level of corruption and rigging of the system. It's being done in the middle of the decade, and it's being done at the direct request of the most powerful man in the country. And if people can't understand how that is a lot more dangerous than typical gerrymandering, then I think we've got work to do to help people wake up to what's happening in their name, in their government, because these politicians are trying to pick their voters instead of voters picking their politicians. And if we walk down that road, I'm worried about where it leads.
And speaking of walking down that road, Democrats in some states like California and New York are saying it's time to fight fire with fire. Governor Newsom in California, Governor Hochul in New York is saying, okay, Texas, if you're going to go down that road, we're going to try to amend our state constitutions to do something similar. And some of them say this with regret, but others say, it's about time. What do you say about that?
Well, I think that word "if" is very important. This should only be done in self-defense. I do not support any preemptive gerrymandering in blue states. I only think this should happen if Texas Republicans go through with this power grab and cheat before the upcoming election. If that happens, then all bets are off. And the Democratic Party cannot unilaterally disarm. You stop a bully by standing up to them, by looking them right in the eye and not blinking. And that's exactly what Democrats need to do if the bullies go forward with their plan in Texas.
You've actually introduced an independent redistricting commission bill in every session since 2021. And I'm just wondering, why do you think that idea doesn't have more appeal?
Because this is not an issue of party, it's an issue of power. The people in power want to hold on to power at the tale as old as time. And this is one of the ways they do it, by gerrymandering. Again, in both political parties, they draw these maps into these crazy shapes to manufacture the outcome they want, to insulate themselves from the will of the public. Again, nothing could be more un-American, nothing could be more undemocratic than that. And it is what leads to extremism in our politics. My constituents often ask me why we at the state legislature aren't focused on funding schools, making neighborhoods safer, expanding access to healthcare, lowering property taxes. Why do we focus on all this crazy culture war stuff? And I tell them redistricting, gerrymandering. When you have deep red seats and deep blue seats, and that's all you don't have swing seats anymore, then the only competition for a politician is in their primary, because the general election is predetermined. And so when the only competition is in your primary, that means the people you have to please are your farthest, most extreme flank of your base. True for Republicans and true for a lot of Democrats. And that is why you see such extremism in our political discourse. Gerrymandering is the rot at the core of our broken political system, and we have to ban it everywhere in all states.
The question for you as a Democrat is, how are you so sure that most of the people in the state don't agree with the Republicans? I think that what they're doing is just fine. How do you know?
And that may be true. Texas got more competitive. I remember when I was growing up in Texas, Democrats lost statewide by 25, 30 points. Now we consistently lose by only single digits. And Joe Biden in 2020 against Donald Trump, it was a 5-point gap in our state. So Texas is not this deep red state that a lot of people think it is. We're much more of a pink state right now, trending toward purple. You had mentioned earlier that we're a small minority in the Texas legislature. That's actually not true. The only reason we can break quorum is because we're such a large minority, where we control about 43% of the seats in the lower chamber. If we were a tiny minority, we couldn't break quorum because we wouldn't have enough members to halt business on the floor. And so I would say to your question that we should all be trying to compete for these votes. And I think that is true for Republicans too. And I don't think you'd be trying to cheat if you felt like you were going to win the next election.
Mm. So what would victory look like for you at the moment? Do you see any movement here? Do you see any possibility that there might be I don't know, a meeting of the minds that would allow you to come home?
I mean, I hope for that. I pray for that. But I am planning, and my colleagues and I are planning for if that doesn't happen. One, I think the public backlash has been overwhelming, again, across the political spectrum, and that's a good thing. Second, I think you're seeing these blue states with trifectas moving toward retaliation. I'm hopeful that that will convince my Republican colleagues and President Trump to walk back from the brink. Because what we don't want is a national tit-for-tat descending spiral of partisanship. We don't want that. I don't think anyone wants that. I certainly don't. And so my hope is that all this pressure from the public, from blue states, all of it catalyzed by our quorum break, will put enough pressure on Republican politicians to do the right thing and walk us back from the edge.
Can you envision a day when people might actually return to something called regular order?
I do. I think that, history is a pendulum. And I do think 10 years of this Trumpian politics, this politics as blood sport, this where it feels more like professional wrestling than civic discourse. I do think people are getting tired of that. I think they see through it. I think they're ready for sincerity and honesty and hope again. I do think those traits are going to make a comeback. At least I hope so.
Texas State Representative James Tellerico, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me again.
From firing the CDC director to terminating research for some life-saving vaccines, RFK Jr. has been tearing apart the American healthcare system. But senators gave him a grilling at the hearing earlier today on his controversial and what most experts say dangerous decisions as health secretary. He fired back, accusing the CDC of failing to keep Americans healthy.
We are the sickest country in the world. That's why we have to fire people at CDC. They did not do their job. This was their job to keep us healthy.
And when pushed on the vital role of vaccines during COVID, Kennedy claimed incorrectly that we were, quote, lied to about everything.
We were lied to about natural immunity. We were lied to about, we were told again and again the vaccines would prevent transmission, they'd prevent infection. It wasn't true.
Dr. Michael Osterholm is the founding director of the University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, and his new book, The Big One, examines the global pandemic and how we should prepare for the next one. He tells Hari Srinivasan why the health secretary's latest moves could spell disaster.
Christiane, thanks. Dr. Michael Osterholm, thanks so much for joining us. Your new book is titled The Big One, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. Before we get to what's in the book, I really want to talk a little bit about what's in the news these days. Just on August 5th, the Health and Human Services Department announced the cut of $500 million in mRNA research, which will impact 22 projects being led by big pharmaceutical companies, right? And in a recent interview there, you said, I can say unequivocally that this was the most dangerous public health decision I've ever seen made by a government body. Explain why.
Well, first of all, again, assuming that the next pandemic might very well be influenza, that's a virus that could easily kill even many more people than we saw with COVID. Our ability to respond to that really is back to vaccines. And currently, the capacity we have in the world to make influenza vaccines is limited. We use chicken eggs largely to grow the virus in. In a year to 15 months after a pandemic began, we could probably make only enough vaccine to vaccinate less than a quarter of the world. It turns out that the mRNA technology, the same we use for COVID, actually can be applied to influenza, and that it's not going to be a better vaccine in the sense that it's going to protect a whole lot more. It'll still provide that same protection we saw with the COVID vaccines, but we can make enough vaccine within a year to probably vaccinate the whole world. That's the difference in millions of lives lost. Just that one simple decision. And we need these vaccines badly for future pandemics. And right now, the likelihood of that happening is close to zero because of that decision.
As part of the rationale for these cuts, Secretary RFK Jr. said, the data shows, these are his words, these vaccines fail to protect effectively against upper respiratory infections like COVID and flu. We're shifting that funding towards safer, broader vaccine platforms that remain effective even as viruses mutate. How do you respond to that?
Well, let me put it into context. One is science. Science has given us the major improvements in health over the last 100 years that meant that life expectancy rose from the 50s to the into 80-year-olds just in 1 year or 100 years. And today we have to count on science. Unfortunately, what Mr. Kennedy is promoting and sharing is, in fact, disinformation, what we really call magic or smoke and mirrors. And the public has to understand that his comments, while they may sound very professional and official, are meaningless. In many cases, they make no sense whatsoever. And so we have to continue to emphasize, if we want to maintain the kind of health protection we've had in this country and around the world and improvements on it, even when we have had great challenges with infectious diseases, we have to stick with the science. If we follow the comments, the recommendations, or the actions of Mr. Kennedy, we are doomed to see public health really denigrated greatly.
You know, back in 2017, you wrote a book called Deadliest Enemy, and it was prescient in a way. And now you've teamed up with the same co-author, Mark Olshaker, and you wrote the big one, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. And I think, you know, a lot of viewers will be surprised that your fear is not COVID-19. It's actually something, you know, worse. And you play out these kind of worst case scenarios and how we should prepare for that. Explain.
Well, when I say worst case scenario, let me just be clear. I'm not even sure that this scenario is the worst case. It's a very realistic situation. As the listeners may remember, back in 2003, we had a global outbreak of SARS. At that time, the first real coronavirus infection that caused serious illness in humans. Because that virus was not very infectious, we were actually able to suppress its transmission and stop it from being spread around. But it did kill 15 to 20% of the people that got infected. Then along came MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, another coronavirus infection in 2012 in the Middle East. And that virus then also spread to Seoul, Korea in 2015, when a visitor to Saudi Arabia returned back to Seoul with this virus infection. In those instances, the MERS virus killed actually almost to 35% of the people it infected. And so you can see the difference with what happened with COVID, where it's only about 1.5% of people died, and I say only with great regret. So the point being here is that if you had a new coronavirus that could kill like SARS or MERS, but be spread like SARS-CoV-2 or COVID, that would be disastrous. And that's what this scenario is about. Well, guess what? In just recent months, we've actually found viruses in bats and caves in China that have the ability to spread likely that of what we saw with COVID. And they also have on board the same genetic pieces that would make it possible for them to cause very serious illness with deaths potentially in that 15 to 35% range. So this is not some kind of science fiction in that sense. This is, I think, anything just a harbinger of things to come, reality that we have to deal with.
So if you could summarize, what are some of the biggest mistakes that we should be learning from COVID?
Well, first of all, we didn't understand as a society that this was going to last for 3 years or more. And therefore, we planned for it much like you might think of with a severe hurricane, where basically you find, for 12 to 18 hours, it's horrible, but you can go into recovery shortly thereafter. And so one of the challenges we had early on is that people wanted to approach this from the idea of a lockdown or closing everything down, and then we'd come back out the other end. And unfortunately, we had a number of our leaders saying that is what would happen. We, in January of 2020, actually laid out the fact that this is likely to last many years. as 2, 3, maybe even 4. And we had to be prepared how we're going to handle for that. And what our real goal was should have been at least, was to make sure that our hospitals were not overrun. The one thing that could save more people's lives was to have adequate health care. But if you're running your hospital at 140, 150% capacity, at that point, you didn't really have any chance to hopefully provide better medical care. And so one of the things we propose is, rather than doing lockdowns, is to use what we call snow days, so that if in fact you are in a community where your hospital bed census is now at 100%, and you know that number every day, it's publicly made available. At that point, you can say to the public, please, for the next 10 to 20 days, we need to back off whatever we can in terms of public engagements, crowds coming together, etc., so that we can get that census down in our hospitals and hopefully provide better medical care. If we had done that, that would have made all the difference in the world in people understanding that lockdowns aren't the answer. There are a number of events just like that we could learn a lot from with COVID.
Just this last week, we had the director of the Centers for Disease Control removed by RFK Jr., and we had several officials who resigned. One of the officials in an interview said that based on what I'm seeing, based on what I've heard with the new members of the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, or ACIP, they're really moving in an ideologic direction where they want to see the undoing of vaccination. They do want to see the undoing of mRNA vaccination. What does that mean for our public health?
Well, in very simple terms, it's a disaster. We are literally watching 100 years of public health activity that has resulted in saving millions and millions of lives, potentially flushed down the drain. And it's that important for the public to understand that, because you need to be talking to your local, your national elected officials and saying, is this the kind of government that you want to provide to us? Because this is not an issue where one day we'll still have a debate, well, which one was right? I can tell you what will be right. It's going to be the science side will be right, because the numbers of people who will die because of following the same kind of ideology approach are going to become very apparent in not a too distant of a future. Again, if we had that same mindset going into a pandemic right now, it would be an utter disaster. And it's not just HHS in Health and Human Services that Secretary Kennedy heads up. Right now, there's no one in the White House, no one who is overseeing biopreparedness for a future biologic event, one that might even be man-made, meaning a bioterrorist attack or a pandemic. This is such a major, major shortcoming in our preparedness. And so I think we need to take a step back. And I just want to point out that, again, ideologically, in the first Trump administration, they did a lot of really good things to help get us better prepared for a biopreparedness event. And I don't know why now suddenly that type of activity is frowned on, if not totally discouraged, when in fact that was the hallmark of the Trump 1 administration.
Hey, we had recently a man who opened fire at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. And he was motivated in part, I guess, by his discontent with the COVID-19 vaccine. And it leads me to kind of come back to that sort of disinformation question. I mean, on the one hand of the column here, you've got scientists working with a series of facts. You're talking about, efficacy and trying to communicate better. And on the other hand, the team that wants to disinform and actively, engage users for their clicks, etc., they don't have to do any of that. They just have to have emotional appeals and kind of get into somebody's head. And that is pretty effective.
That's scary. And let me just tell you on a personal level, having been in the front row of the pandemic response during COVID and having received death threats, I know what the concerns are of many of my colleagues in terms of, why do we do our job every day? What do we do to protect ourselves and our family members? This is a huge challenge. And in the first instance, the public has to understand what's at risk here. Is losing public health will mean that there will be many, many more outbreaks of diseases that we could easily control with vaccines or by having safe water supplies, dealing with mosquito populations that are suddenly spreading exotic viruses around the country. That's the kinds of things that public health does all the time. And if public health does its job really well, you never hear about anything because we actually prevent it from happening. And I think that's what the challenge is right now, is because we have enjoyed so much prevention from groups like CDC over the years. People say, it's not really necessary. Well, it will come back. And again, I just want to stress over and over again, we can't prepare for the big one if we're not, in fact, preparing for everyday events right now. Somebody has to call the question, are we going to continue to pursue the kind of activities that Mr. Kennedy wants us to do, that some of the public are surely willing to even bring violence to the table to deal with that issue? Or are we going to continue to maintain that science-based approach where basically we're constantly learning about these infectious diseases or other health conditions and trying to make the world a better place? Remember, no one goes into public health to get rich. No one goes into public health to become famous. People go into public health to serve. They go into public health to help. And that's, I think, the question we have right now. What is it going to take it to get us back to that norm?
Right now, our conversation so far has been focused primarily on the United States. But I also want to ask about what happens when USAID has been slashed as it has been, and what our visibility is for viruses, future pandemics overseas, because viruses don't care about borders, right? And I wonder, is there, that loss of funding and infrastructure? Can you either quantify or qualify the effects that will have downstream?
We have withdrawn support, as you noted, from USAID, one of the most successful soft power efforts ever put forward by any government, not just ours, in terms of lives saved, in terms of the endearment of locals in countries around the world for the United States support, and as well as the fact we pulled out of the World Health Organization. We're no longer a member there. We actually are not part of the routine communications. We are not contributing to knowledge at WHO, but we're also not learning from it. Why is that important? Because there are so many infectious diseases, for example, that start on a distant shore and can come to our country. We look at what happened in 2015-16 with Ebola in Africa and the concern we had for it getting here. By not participating on the international level, we actually shoot ourselves in the foot in terms of protecting ourselves. Borders in of themselves will not keep infectious agents from going from one country to the other. What does make a difference is stopping those outbreaks in their tracks in the countries where they begin. And so we are losing all of that opportunity. We are going to see a resurgence of HIV/AIDS. We're going to see a resurgence of drug-resistant tuberculosis. We're going to see a resurgence of malaria in areas that used to control the mosquitoes that are not now going to happen. And guess what? They're all going to land in the United States eventually. And because we live in a world where travel now is so ubiquitous, we're also going to see U.S. citizens going to countries around the world in much greater risk for being in that country than before because of this very decision to pull out of the global health arena. And so all I can say is that this, again, is a penny-wise, pound-foolish effort. We are not helping us at all. We keep talking about putting America first. This puts America last.
You're leading an initiative called the Vaccine Integrity Project. What's the need that you're trying to address with this?
Well, what we realized early on after the election was that based on the 2025 document and what the priorities were for dismantling public health, that one of the first areas to go was likely to be vaccines. And of course, with Mr. Kennedy being nominated for Secretary of Health and Human Services, we recognized that his major anti-vaccine theme was going to be carried through. Actually, in November of last year, I wrote an article in the New York Times laying out what likely could be lost in public health in the future with a Kennedy HHS appointment. And sure enough, the vaccine issues that we worried about are happening. Let me just say that at this point, it's very, very clear that the kind of things that we're seeing happen at the federal level are going to continue to happen unless we see Congress step up and begin to insert itself into this process. Remember at the time when the confirmation hearings were held, we actually had Mr. Kennedy promising to to Senator Cassidy that he would not take vaccines away from anyone. Well, he did. That really brought us at our center in Minneapolis with the idea that we need to figure out what can we do to help out if, in fact, the ACIP, the Advisory Communication Practices, is suddenly done in. What roles did they play? And so we started this new initiative. And with that, we actually first did focus groups with a number of vaccine enterprise experts, all the way from research and development to the final shot into the arm, to say, what can any non-governmental organization do to help support what one's there with ACIP? And one of the things we learned was, in fact, to make recommendations for vaccine use, we needed to have the comprehensive data that the ACIP used to present. Well, we picked that up. We actually, as a effort out of the VIP project, begin doing a review of all of the vaccine information for COVID, for RSV, and for influenza, to have it in time for this upcoming winter season. And we did the analysis where we were able to identify over 17,500 different pieces of information, articles about these vaccines. We summarized that using a very specific protocol approach. And that is now the information being used by our medical societies to determine their own vaccine recommendations. And so from that perspective, we are now providing what ACIP once did.
Founding Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Michael Osterholm. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.